Auditor Strell held my left sock up to the light like it was evidence in a murder trial. Wool, he announced to the 40 Vesek seated on the risers behind him. Animal hair. They shear it off a domesticated grazing beast, and then they knit it. By hand in some cases. The laughter that went through the cargo bay sounded like a flock of geese landing on a tin roof. I stood next to my own equipment table and waited for him to finish. That was most of my job that morning. Stand, wait, answer when asked. I had 31 years in supply behind me and 2 winters on the East Antarctic Plateau, and I had learned a long time ago that the man holding the clipboard thinks he is running the room right up until the weather decides otherwise. My name is Raymond Decker, Senior Quartermaster Terran Auxiliary Detachment 5, on loan to the Concord salvage operation at Pelham Station, which sits on the ice shelf of a moon called Hevron, where the air is thin, the sun is a rumor, and the thermometer spends its whole life below anything you would call reasonable. The Vesek ran the station, the Vesek ran the audit, and on that particular morning, the Vesek were having the time of their lives. Item 9, Strell said, setting my sock down with 2 feathered fingers, the way a man handles something he suspects of being contagious, a coat, or so the manifest claims. He lifted my anorak off the table and turned it slowly so the audience could appreciate it. Waxed canvas, wind-tight, hood ruffed with synthetic fur. A good coat. It had kept me alive at -78 on the plateau, and it had cost less than the buckle on Strell's uniform belt. No power source, Strell said. No thermal filaments. No microclimate regulation. No telemetry. He paused for effect. He was good at pauses. It is, in the most literal sense available to me, a tarpaulin with sleeves. More geese on more tin. A row of off-shift surveyors had wandered in to watch, and a cluster of junior clerks stood along the back wall with their slates out, not taking notes, just enjoying themselves. The Vesek are a handsome people if you like raptors. 6.5 feet of slate-gray feathers, gold eyes, beaked faces built for expressions of refined disappointment. They evolved on a cold steppe world, and they never let anyone forget it. Cold was their inheritance, their pride, their national sport, and here was Earth, the warm, wet world, the soft world, sending 5 people and 900 kilos of farm equipment to a polar salvage posting. Quartermaster Decker, Strell said, help me understand. When this garment fails, what informs you of the failure? I get cold, I said. He let that sit, head tilted, gold eyes bright, and the bay rippled with that goose honk laughter again. He wasn't a cruel bird, Strell. I want that understood. He was precise, ambitious, and performing for a promotion board that existed mostly in his own head, and we were the best material that had come through Pelham Station in years. I'd have probably done the same in his position. I'd like to think I'd have been funnier about it. You get cold, he repeated, and made a notation with the elegant little stylus the Vesek all carried. The instrument and the alarm are the same component. Remarkable economy. Lieutenant Ojo stood at the end of our table with her hands behind her back and her face composed the way she'd held it for 2 straight hours. Amara Ojo had led cold weather detachments on 3 worlds and said maybe 40 words since we landed. Behind her, Specialist Voss leaned against the bulkhead with the patient slouch of a man who has watched other people be wrong about engines his entire life. Doc Amura and Petty Officer Sandu flanked the far table, where our medical kit and rigging gear were laid out in rows for inspection, every item tagged, every tag in my handwriting. The audit had been announced as a formality. Equipment readiness review, joint operations, standard protocol before the Tessely vein recovery run. Somewhere between item 1 and item 9 it had become a matinee. Item 14, Strell said, moving down the table, hand coverings, 2 pairs. Note, please, that the outer pair is connected by a cord which passes through both sleeves of the garment. He held up my mittens and let them dangle by their string, swinging gently, while 40 Vesek leaned forward to look. So that they cannot be lost, he said. They tether their hand coverings to their bodies, as one does with infants. As one does with anyone whose bare hand freezes to the first thing it touches at -80, I said. Dropping a glove on the plateau is how you lose the hand. The string costs nothing and weighs nothing. And yet, Strell said, our gauntlets do not come off unless commanded. I know, I said. I read the manual. I had to. Cover to cover twice, with my own notations in the margins. Nobody asked about that, which suited me fine. Strell set the mittens down and worked along the table. He gave the slit-lens snow goggles 30 seconds of theater. He gave the spirit thermometer a full minute. It's a sealed glass tube on a lanyard, dyed alcohol, accurate to 2 degrees, functional at any temperature this moon could produce, and it has no battery, which to a Vesek is the same as having no soul. It contains, he said, reading the tag, colored drinking alcohol. Denatured, I said. Don't drink it. I assure you, Quartermaster, no one here intends to consume your instruments. A wave of honking from the risers. The junior clerks along the back wall had given up pretending to work. One of them, A small bird named Pinnet, who ran the station's store's ledger and had been decent to me in a wary sideways fashion since we arrived, was the only one in the bay writing anything down. I noticed Pinnet copied the thermometer's specifications off the tag before Strel moved on. Slowly, like the numbers bothered him. Item 22, Strel had reached the stove. Brass, 2 burners, paraffin tank, a windscreen of folded tin. Voss kept it tuned the way some men keep guns. A pressurized container of liquid hydrocarbons, Strel announced, which is set on fire indoors, beneath a vessel of melting snow. I am informed this is not a punishment, but a kitchen. It boils a liter in 4 minutes at altitude, I said. It has 3 moving parts. I can fix all 3 of them with my thumbs. Our hearth cores boil nothing, Strel said. They warm a shelter to a set temperature and hold it there for a standard year silently while monitoring the health of every occupant. He looked at the stove with genuine wonder, the way you'd look at a flint axe in a museum case. Item 23, a second smaller fire device. Item 24, matches. Chemical friction igniters. In a wax-sealed tin, he turned to the risers. There are 200 of them. Hand-counted, I am told. 240, I said. I topped it off Tuesday. That got the biggest laugh of the morning, and I'll be honest, I let it land. There's no profit in fighting a room. The room thinks what it thinks. My job was the table, and the table was in order. The grease pencil was item 30. China marker, black, ordinary as dirt. Writes on metal, glass, ice, wet plastic, at any temperature upside down, forever. Strel picked it up, examined it from both ends, and could not at first determine what it was for, which gave the risers a fine minute of speculation. When I explained, he made a small delighted sound in his throat. A crayon, he said. Field issue. For the writing of words upon objects in conditions where, he checked the tag, electronic systems may be unavailable. He looked up at me. Quartermaster, may I keep this? As a souvenir of this morning, I will have it framed beside my commission. Sign for it, I said, and pushed the issue log across the table. He signed for it. Beautiful handwriting for a man with 4 fingers. He clipped my grease pencil into the breast pocket of that magnificent uniform, where it rode for the rest of the audit like a fishbone on a wedding cake, and the bay honked itself hoarse, and I wrote item 30. Issued. Auditor Strel, on request in the log, and underneath it in the remarks column, I wrote the date and one word, pending. I keep a second ledger. Gray cover, no markings. It lives in my breast pocket the way Strel's stylus lived in his. While he worked through my table, item by item, performance by performance, I was doing the same arithmetic in the other direction, because looking at other people's equipment and asking quiet questions about it is not a hobby for me. It is the actual job, though nobody at Pelham Station had been told that yet, and orders said I wasn't to announce it. So while the geese honked, I looked at what the Vesek were wearing. Filament suits, gorgeous things, woven heating elements managed by a controller on the hip, powered by lattice cell packs rated, per the manual I'd read twice, to minus 71 degrees. Below that, the manual got quiet. I looked at the gauntlets that came off when commanded, and wondered what they did when the commanding stopped. I looked at the slates everyone held, the doors that opened on power, the heaters that were software all the way down. I had 40 entries in the gray ledger already, and the audit wasn't half over. Item 41, Strel said, and his voice told the room dessert had arrived. He held up a short white cylinder, turning it so the light caught it. Candle, wax, quantity, 30. He let the silence do its work. 30 candles brought 11 light years to a Concord salvage station with 4 redundant fusion plants. He set it down with exaggerated care. Quartermaster, the candles, please. A candle heats a snow shelter from minus 50 to survivable, I said. 1 flame, 1 body length of trapped air, 9 or 10 hours per candle. It also tells you when to get out. Flame goes long and blue, your air's going bad. Flame dies, you're already in trouble. I shrugged. It's a heater, a clock and a gas detector. Weighs 90 grams, never needs a software update. For about 2 seconds, the bay was quiet, and I watched maybe 3 birds out of 40 actually run the numbers. Pinnet was one of them. Then Strel spread his wings just enough to catch the overheads. Vesek do this when they're about to be quotable, and said, honored colleagues, I withdraw my concerns. The humans have brought fire. We may yet be taught to cook with it, and the room went up like a poultry house with a fox in it, and the moment passed. It always passes. I've audited 7 kinds of station on 4 kinds of world, and the moment when somebody almost does the arithmetic always passes, right up until the day the weather does it for them. Flight Commander Vaik arrived for the verdict. He was older than Strel, broader through the chest, feathers gone pale silver at the throat, and he wore his cold weather record the way other men wear medals, which on a Vesek is to say he wore almost nothing at all. Open collar at 40 below ambient in the bay, old school. The risers stood when he came in, and Strel straightened like a wire. Vaik walked the length of our table without touching anything. He stopped at the candles. He stopped longer at the sledge, our big cargo runner, ash frame, hide lashing, steel-shod wooden runners, built by a man in Norway whose family had been building them since before anybody on this moon could fly. Vajek looked at it the way you look at an animal you can't identify. Wood, he said at last, from a tree. Yes, Commander, I said. It does not seize, he said. It wasn't quite a question, so I didn't quite answer it. He moved on, took his place at the head of the bay, and accepted Strell's slate with the audit results, and the room arranged itself for the kill. Out the high windows behind him, Hevron's daylight lay flat and white across the shelf, and along the horizon there was a faint shimmer in the air, a glittering, like dust-catching light where no dust should be. I took out the gray ledger and noted the time. The verdict took 4 minutes and was, in its way, a work of art. Strell read it. Vajek presided. The risers savored. The Terran Auxiliary Detachment's equipment was assessed as non-viable for Concord Polar operations, with individual line items graded on a scale that ran from obsolescente down through decorative to a final category. Strell had clearly invented that morning museum grade. My anorak was museum grade, so was the stove. The candles received a special annotation. Ceremonial. The operational consequence came from Vajek, delivered without malice, which somehow made it worse for the room and easier for me. The Tessely vein recovery would proceed at dawn with an all-Vesic column. The human detachment would remain at Pelham Station in a support capacity. Stores. Snow clearance. The phrase he used translated as warm-side duties, and you could hear 40 Beaks not quite laughing. Understood, Lieutenant Ojo said. Her entire closing argument. We packed our museum back into its crates, every tag in place, and the audience filed out in high spirits, and that was the end of the matinee. Could have gone worse, Voss said, lifting the stove crate. How? Sandu said. Could have made us watch them load. We watched them load anyway. It was worth watching. The Tessely vein had gone down on the shelf 8 days earlier, 311 kilometers out, a Concord freighter with a cargo of medical isotopes and 3 crew alive in a survival blister rigged from her stern section, alive and confirmed. By tight beam, drawing power off the Vanguard relay the first Vesek flight had carried out and left running. The column's job was to bring back the crew, the isotopes, and the flight recorder, in that order. 41 personnel, Vajek commanding. Strell attached as audit observer because excellence undocumented, as he told the loading bay, is excellence wasted. And the equipment was excellent. I want that in the record because what came later can read like I'm saying the Vesic were fools, and they were not. The field sledges ran on effect-cast runners that touched the ice with nothing but a managed magnetic film. Silent, frictionless, beautiful. The shelter membranes packed into cylinders the size of my forearm and bloomed into heated domes on a voice command. The filament suits managed 40 separate body zone climates while reporting cell-level biotelemetry back to the column-net. The hearth cores, the isotope heart of each camp, were rated to hold a 5-bird shelter at step-noon comfort for a standard year. It was the best cold-weather equipment money could buy, designed by a cold-adapted species at the height of its confidence, and every single piece of it assumed the grid. Power, software, telemetry, command. The suit assumed the controller. The controller assumed the cell. The cell assumed a recharge cradle. The shelter assumed the hearth core. The hearth core assumed its regulator. The sledges assumed the nav constellation. And the whole gorgeous assumption ran on the further assumption that Hevron would behave the way the survey said it would. I stood on the gantry above the bay with the gray ledger and wrote it all down, line by line, rating by rating, in handwriting nobody at Pelham Station would ever mistake for admiration or contempt. Quartermaster's hand. Just the facts. Lattice cells, rated -71. Membrane brittleness threshold -76 per manufacturer, untested per station log. Gauntlet release, powered. Door actuation, powered. Comms, lattice array, line of sight relays, no analog backup on the manifest. I underlined that one. Pinnett found me up there. The little clerk came sideways along the gantry with a slate held against his chest like a shield, stood next to me for a while, and watched the sledges glide out the bay doors into the white. The candle figures, Pinnett said finally. 9 hours at survivable. On Earth, that is documented. 300 years of polar travel, I said. We lost a lot of people learning it. The candle's one of the things we kept. Pinnett was quiet. Below us, the last sledge in the column carried the spare hearth cores, stacked and gleaming like eggs. My grandmother's flock crossed the vessening ice on foot, he said. Before the lattice, I have read her band's manifest. It is very short and there is wax on it. Then he left quickly the way you leave after saying something you didn't plan to say, and I added a line to the ledger that had nothing to do with equipment. Some of them remember. The eve of departure produced one more piece of theater, and I include it because it ended up mattering more than anything else said at Pelham Station that week. Strell, in his capacity as audit observer, requested a comparative field demonstration for documentation purposes which translated out of bureaucratic Vesek means he wanted an encore. The venue was the Apron, after second shift ambient -58. The premise was simple. The human detachment would demonstrate its shelter doctrine, and a Veseki field team would demonstrate theirs, side by side, timed, in front of whoever cared to watch. Everyone cared to watch. The gallery on the Apron was bigger than the audits, and this time they'd brought refreshments. The Vesek went first. A four-bird team stepped out, one of them spoke a word, and a membrane shelter bloomed up off the ice like a conjuring trick, heated, lit, humming, door dilated and waiting in 41 seconds. It was genuinely beautiful. The gallery clicked their beaks in applause and settled in to enjoy the second act, because the second act was four humans with shovels. We cut snow blocks for 25 minutes. There is no way to make cutting snow blocks look impressive, and we didn't try. Sandu and I sawed, Voss stacked, Ojo squared the trench, and the gallery provided commentary I will not transcribe in full, though I noted Strell's line about Earth having dispatched its finest masons across 11 light years to build a root cellar, which even Ojo conceded later was decent material. At minute 26, we roofed the trench, banked it, hung the canvas door and lit one candle inside, and I posted the spirit thermometer at head height where the slate feeds could image it, and we stood back, steaming gently, looking like men who had lost. For documentation, Strell said to the gallery as much as to us, the Concorde shelter achieved habitability in under 1 minute. The Terran shelter required 26, and its heating plant is a votive. Honk, honk, all down the Apron. He turned to me, gracious as a game show host. Quartermaster, in fairness, is there any figure you wish documented? 2, I said. Pull your shelter cell and read my thermometer at dawn. He liked that. It had the shape of a wager, and the Vesek love a wager the way they love a manifest. The terms got formalized on the spot, witnessed, logged, the whole grammar. Both shelters to stand overnight unoccupied, the membrane running on its standard cell, the trench running on its votive. And Strell, enjoying himself enormously, added the flourish the Apron would still be quoting at the inquiry. And should the candle outlast the lattice, I will requisition the animal hair socks at my own expense and wear them on parade. At dawn, the membrane stood dark. Its cell had spent itself holding set point against the night and gone into protective shutdown around the 5th hour, and the shelter had cooled, obediently to ambient, and the morning frost had sealed its dilating door shut, a detail I want preserved because it is the whole story in one image. The door that only opens on power, frozen shut in a dead shelter. My trench was sitting at -4 with 3 hours left on the candle. Pinnit read both figures out loud to the Apron, twice, because the first reading was Msmetlanitsen, and somebody asked for a confirmation. It should have changed something. It didn't, not that morning. The duty office logged the result as anomalous, attributable to test conditions. The gallery dispersed talking about breakfast, and Strell, who was many things but never a welcher, noted the sock debt in his own audit file, payable upon return from the recovery. The column had a schedule. The schedule had been certified. I went back to my counter and added one line to the gray ledger. Demonstration conclusive. Conclusion declined. The column flew out at dawn, which on Hevron is a technicality involving clocks. We cleared snow. I will not pretend the warm side duties were a hardship. A quartermaster can always find work, and station stores were a mess of the particular kind that grows wherever supply officers have been promoted. For charisma, I rebuilt their bin index. Sandu re-rigged the cargo gantry, which had been signed off annually and lubricated never. Voss adopted the station's snow tractors. 2 proud lattice-driven machines and 1 diesel unit Earth had shipped up with us over Vesek objections. A squat yellow thing the loadmaster's office had refused to register, and the station log listed, with magnificent contempt, as mule, non-standard. Voss spent his evenings with it the way other men sit with dogs. And Dakamura watched the weather. That was her habit on every posting, and on this one it had teeth. Because the human detachment had brought, along with the museum, a set of instruments the audit had graded somewhere below the candles, a recording barometer in a brass case, a sling psychrometer, and a logbook. The station's own meteorology came down off the survey constellation, processed, smoothed, certified, and the constellation said the deep winter pattern was 4 weeks out. The brass case said otherwise. It had been falling for 2 days, slow and steady, the long, smooth fall that on the Antarctic plateau means the sky is about to go clear and still and murderous. The Vesek have a name for it, it turns out. Pinnit told me later, after everything, a deep clear. The old flocks feared it more than any storm. No wind, no cloud, the moon's heat pouring off the shelf into naked space, the temperature falling like a stone down a well, and with it on Hevron, the thing the survey had noted as a curiosity, and the equipment cataloged as within tolerance, the glitter. Charged dust off the dry ice fields, fine as smoke, lifted by the temperature gradient and strung through the air in slow curtains of static. Pretty as anything you ever saw. Murder on electronics. Imura took her barometer trace to the station's duty office on the second evening. The duty officer was polite. The constellation forecast was certified. The column was 300 kilometers out on certified ice and certified equipment. The Vanguard was already at the wreck, and the recovery was 18 hours from complete. The human concern was noted, with thanks, in the visitor log. In the visitor log, Amira said, back in our quarters. She said it the way you'd report a wound. Noted is noted, Ojo said. Ray. Fuel stayed on the mule. Full plus drums, I said. Voss keeps her wet. Paraffin pans went under the sump yesterday. He says she'll light at anything this moon's got. Ojo nodded once and went back to her book, and that was the whole conversation. And if you'd been standing in the room, you'd never have known that the detachment had just gone on a war footing, because what it looked like was 5 people doing inventory. That night, I pulled the cold cache crates and rechecked every tag. Wool, candles, stove, sledge, wands, rope, the crank radio, the old high-frequency set with the wire antenna Sandu had strung between 2 mass stanchions our first week, against regulations for amateur purposes, he said. 240 matches. I topped the tin off again anyway. The temperature at Pelham Station at midnight was minus 62, 4 degrees below the certified forecast, and falling on the long, smooth curve. Out on the shelf, the column's evening report came in crisp and cheerful on the lattice array. Camp established 190 kilometers, all systems nominal, recovery on schedule. Vaic sign-off, Strel's documentation appended, 11 attachments, holograms of the camp. The shelters glowed like a string of pearls on the white. The morning report was shorter, cold ahead of model, it said, recalibrating, proceeding. The afternoon report was 1 line. Relay 4 degraded, investigating, and the evening report did not come. I was in the store's office when the duty officer's runner came for me, which tells you something all by itself, because there were 140 Vesek at Pelham Station, and the runner came to the human store's office quietly, the way you go to a door you laughed at in daylight. Pinnett stood in the corridor with his slate against his chest and his feathers flat, and behind him the station's certified weather feed was flagging its first amber bar, and through the corridor window the whole northern horizon was glittering, floor to sky, like a curtain of ground glass hung across the world, with the temperature reading in the corner of the pane falling through minus 71 while I watched. Quartermaster Decker, Pinnett said. The prefect asks, how quickly can the museum be packed? Prefect Kala ran Pelham Station from a glass-walled office above the operations floor, and when I got there the glass was full of amber. She was old for a field posting, narrow, precise feathers the color of weathered slate, and she did me the courtesy of skipping the part where we pretended the morning in the cargo bay hadn't happened. 3 hours ago the column's net began shedding nodes, she said. We attributed it to Relay 4. It was not Relay 4. The temperature on the shelf is 11 degrees below the certified model, and the static phenomenon is the densest on station record. 40 minutes ago we received a partial transmission from Flight Commander Vaic on the emergency band. She turned her slate around so I could read it. The Vesek emergency band carried text when it couldn't carry voice, and the text had come through chewed, every third word hashed out by static. Cells stalling column-wide, it said in the gaps. Sledges down. Shelters holding at. Vanguard not responding. Do not send second column in glitter. Repeat, do not send. He is protecting the relief from his own equipment, Kala said. Every airframe and sledge I have runs on the same cells that are stalling under him. Sending them into that. She moved one wing edge toward the window, the glittering wall across the north. Is sending them to fail at a different distance. My meteorology section now concurs with your doctor's brass instrument, for whatever that concession is worth at this hour. The event will deepen for 30 to 40 hours before it breaks. The column has 183 kilometers of ice between itself and this station, and the Vanguard at the wreck has been silent for 5 hours, and the survival blister those 3 crew are living in draws its power from the Vanguard cells. She stopped. Outside, somebody's certified forecast ticked another degree down. Quartermaster, she said. I am told your vehicle is non-standard. Profoundly, Prefect, I said. I am told it burns liquid fuel, that its instruments contain colored alcohol, that its operators are tethered to their hand coverings, each item laid down flat, like cards. I sat in the 3rd row this morning. I heard the audit. She looked at me with those gold eyes gone very still. Tell me plainly, because I no longer trust my own manifests. Will your museum run in that? Prefect, I said. That is the weather it was built in. Lieutenant Ojo took the formal request, standing in the operations doorway, listened to the whole thing without moving, and said, we'll need the bay doors and a crane crew in 20 minutes, and your infirmary warm. Then she looked at me, and I went to wake the museum up. I'm going to tell you what we packed, because the packing was the whole battle and everything after it was delivery. The mule, Full tanks plus 6 drums, paraffin pans already under her sump, Voss's preheat rig standing by, the big Norwegian sledge and the 2 light ones, lashed in train. Every shelter candle, every match. Both stoves, 40 liters of paraffin. The wool, and here's the thing about wool that no audit on this moon had asked about, we'd brought crates of it, oversize, because the requisition I'd filed on Earth had been written for a joint posting, blanket weight numbers, not human-shaped ones. Watch caps that would fit over a feathered skull if you cut 2 slits. Blankets that don't care what species you are. Sleeping bags rated to numbers I'd never personally enjoyed. 200 chemical heat pads, the crank radio, the HF set, the wire antenna on its reel, wands, 4 bundles, orange flags rope, the spirit thermometer around my neck where it lives, and the tea. I want the tea in the record. 11 kilos of black tea, sugar in bricks, butter in tins, because the oldest cold weather medicine on Earth is hot, sweet and fat, and the audit had graded it rations recreational. Sandhu rigged the sledge train. Imra packed the casualty kit with Pinot running ahead of her through the station stores, pulling everything she pointed at. No requisition forms. The first time I ever saw a Vesic clerk break procedure on purpose. And out on the apron, at minus 81 degrees in the flat starlit dark, in front of a gallery of silent feathered faces at the windows of the operations floor, Henrik Voss lit the paraffin pans under the mule's sump, waited 11 minutes by his watch, climbed up, set the throttle, looked at nothing in particular, and pushed the starter. She caught on the second revolution. A bang, a stumble, a gout of black smoke that hung in the still air like an exclamation mark. And then the old steady hammer of a diesel at idle, the least elegant sound ever made by machinery. The sound of a thing too simple to know it was supposed to be impossible. Up on the operations floor, nobody honked. Kalla's voice came down to the apron on the station address system. Pelham Station logs the departure of relief element. Designation, and there was a pause. And you could hear something that might have been the first sense of humor the station had shown all week, Museum 1. We rolled north at 1:15 station midnight, Voss driving, Ojo navigating, Sandhu on the rig, Amura with her kit, me with the manifests and the radio watch, and 1 passenger, because Pinette had presented himself at the bay doors with a field pack and the station's only current copy of the column's last known positions and refused, in flat bureaucratic language I frankly admired, to transmit it rather than carry it. Transmission integrity cannot be guaranteed in current conditions, he said, standing very straight, shaking slightly. Best practice is physical delivery. Ojo looked at him for 2 seconds and said, "Get in. I'll tell you what driving into a deep clear is like. It is like driving into a jewelry store with the lights off. No wind, no sound but the engine. The headlights go out ahead of you and come back wrong, scattered into a billion points. Because the air itself is hanging there full of frozen glitter, and every point of it is a little static spark waiting for somewhere to live. It gets into everything with a circuit and shortens its life. It settled on the mule's hood and made small blue worms of light around the mirror, mounts, and did nothing else, because there was nothing else for it to do. You cannot crash software that isn't there. The cold is the part I won't dress up. Minus 84 by my thermometer at the first wand stop. Cold like a pressure, like the air had been replaced by something with a grudge. We ran heated by the engine's coolant loop and a candle lantern swinging from the cab frame, wrapped to the eyes, working the buddy system, 30-second face checks, and the mule hammered on through it at a steady 30 kilometers an hour, which is not fast, and which I would not have traded that night for any number you can reach with a magnetic film. Relay 4 sat 60 kilometers out, the first of the line-of-sight masts the Vanguard had planted on the way north, and we stopped at it because Ojo wanted the failure looked at with eyes before we drove 100 more kilometers into whatever had caused it. It looked perfect. That was the unsettling part. No storm damage, no toppled mast, no burn marks, just a slim, elegant lattice array standing in the starlight with every status light dark, furred all over with a fine sparkling fuzz of dust, like a casting fresh out of a mold. Sandhu went up the mast with a brush and a hand lamp while I held the base, and he was up there maybe 4 minutes before he called down 2 words. It's inside. The glitter had gone in through the cooling louvers, the way dust goes everywhere, and the cold had done the rest. The Vesic built their electronics dense and warm cord, which works until the day the ambient drops so far that the core heaters throttle past their design ceiling and the condensation gradients move somewhere new, and a charged particle finds a board it was never supposed to reach. The relay hadn't been wrecked, it had been politely, fatally confused, every safety system tripping every other safety system, the whole stack folding its hands and waiting for a reset command from a network that could no longer carry one. Sandhu cleaned it, cycled it, got 2 lights to flicker, and watched it fold its hands again, and came down the mast shaking his head. Nothing wrong with it, he said. which from a rigger is a diagnosis, not an absolution. Nothing wrong with any of it. It's all going to do exactly this, all the way north. Everything they own is this relay. Ojo gave it 8 more minutes while Sindhu lashed our own answer to the mast. A dumb beacon off the mule's spares, battery, spark gap, a wire loop transmitting nothing but a thump on the old frequencies once a second into the dark. A lighthouse, in effect, audible to any crank radio inside 80 kilometers. The audit had graded our crank radio quaint. We left it thumping behind us like a heartbeat and drove on, and I will tell you that for the next hour nobody in the cab said much, because there is a particular silence that comes over a crew when the question changes from whether the certified equipment failed to how fast, and 41 birds were sitting out at the end of that arithmetic. Sandhu got the HF set working off the whip while we rolled, and at 2:30 he raised the column, not the lattice net. The emergency band, voice this time scratchy and faint, and the voice was Strell's. I want to be careful with this part, because it would be easy to make it sound better than it was, and the man deserves the truth. He was not panicking. The Vesek don't much. The step bred it out of them, but his voice had lost all its performance, every gram of it, and what was left was thin and very young, and reading by hand off a grease-marked shelter wall, because his slate had died with the net. Relief element, this is the column, he said. I am instructed to pass our state. We are 41. We have casualties of cold but no dead. Shelter membranes are failing progressively. As temperature falls, the hearth cores are warm but their circulation has stopped. The suit's a long scratch of static. The suit stalled at -76. We are sharing gauntlets in rotation. The flight commander has consolidated us into the 4 soundest shelters and ordered me to log everything. So I am logging. A pause. With the crayon. Item 30. I am advised it functions at all temperatures. Another pause, longer, full of glitter hiss. It does. Column? Museum 1, I said. Sign the log when you're done. We bill for that pencil. The static carried something back that might have been a laugh, or might have just been Hevron. And Ojo took the handset and got the grid coordinates. And Voss leaned into the throttle, and the mule put her head down and hammered north into the glitter with 160 kilometers to go. We found the rear guard first. They weren't supposed to be there. The column's last logged order of march had them tucked in at the rear with the spare hearth cores, but cells don't stall by rank, and theirs had stalled early, and the column had been eating distance ahead of them in the dark before anyone understood the net wasn't dropping packets, it was dropping people. Pinnock caught it. He'd been riding with his face to the side glass for an hour, not because anyone told him to, but because watching was a thing he could do, and at a few minutes before 4 he made a sharp sound and pointed, and out on the flat to the west of our line there was a light. Not a beacon. Beacons are regular. This was a slow, irregular flash, long, short, a hand passing in front of a flame, and I knew what it was before the mule finished turning, because there is only one reason a light flashes like that on a dead plane, and it is that somebody is making it flash with the only muscle they still trust. 6 Vesek. 2 field sledges, both dead, parked nose-to-tails a windbreak against wind that had never come because a deep clear doesn't bring wind, it just sits on you. They'd gotten one shelter membrane half-bloom before it froze mid-deployment, brittle as eggshell. It had split along a fold seam, and they'd weighted the split with cargo and crawled in, 6 bodies in a space rated for 3, which was the first correct cold-weather decision the Concord's equipment had allowed them all night. The light was a maintenance lamp, hand-cranked, the only crank-driven device on their entire manifest, and a surveyor named Kesseth had been lying in the shelter mouth flashing it at the empty south for 5 hours on the theory, he told us later, that the humans would come, and the humans were primitive, and primitives look at the horizon. I will let that stand without comment, as I am told is best practice for compliments assembled from insults. Amura ran the triage with her headlamp in her teeth and her hands working bare in 30-second shifts might count her rules. Frost injury to feet and wing edges on all 6, 1 bad. A junior named Averitt whose suit controller had died first and politely told no one. The suit holding its last setting while the bird inside it cooled, biotelemetry reporting cell-level detail to a net that no longer existed. 2 more borderline. Core temperatures down across the board. The Vesek run hot, which had been saving them, and dense down under the contour feathers, which had been saving them more, and every one of them was wearing, over the down, a magnificent stalled machine that no longer closed at the wrists. So we did the old things, in the old order, shelter, heat, sugar, in that order, fast. Sandhu and I cut snow blocks while Voss kept the engine turning, and we did not build anything clever. We banked the blocks around the split membrane and roofed the gap with the spare canvas, turning their broken egg into a thing the audit would have graded somewhere below decorative. Then the candles went in, 3 of them, in tins, spaced down the center line, and the stove in the entrance with a pot of snow on it, and within 20 minutes, By the spirit thermometer I hung from the ridgeline, the inside of that miserable patched dome had come up through -20 and kept climbing, and 6 Vesic lay in the candlelight watching the little flames the way I have seen men watch a sunrise after a bad night at sea. "It is the same wax," Kesseth said. His voice was wrecked with cold, but it was coming back, and the first thing it did on the way back was argue. "The same item." I sat in the second row. "It is the same candle." "Same candle," I agreed, and put a mug in his hands. Tea, sugar enough to stand a spoon in, a knuckle of butter melting on top, the whole thing indecent by any civilized standard, and exactly what 300 years of frozen coastlines and dead explorers taught us to put inside a chilled body. He drank it the way casualties always drink it, in small astonished sips with both hands. The wool went on over the down and under the dead suits, caps with slits cut for the ear tufts, blankets. The chemical pads cracked and shaken and tucked in against the big leg arteries where Amura pointed. There's a moment with every casualty when the shivering changes gear, stops being the desperate kind and becomes the business-like kind, the body picking its work back up, and one by one the 6 of them crossed that line in our patched shelter while the candles burned level and yellow, and the glitter hissed on the canvas overhead like dry rain. Avrit, the bad one, we ran to the mule on a light sledge and put him in the cab heat with Amura, and his feet were her project for the next 10 hours, and he kept them. All his toes. She is the best I've ever worked with, and the kit she did it from weighs 11 kilos and contains, per the audit, field medicine. Historical. It was while we were striking the rescue that Kesseth stood up, wrapped in a gray blanket with a watch cap sitting between his ear tufts like a tea cozy on a hawk, and tried to give the apology. They do it formally, the Vesic, wings half spread, eyes down, it's a whole grammar. Ojo cut it off at the second word. "Later," she said. "Your cargo until your feet pass inspection. Get on the sledge." And Kesseth, surveyor first class, second row, who 5 days earlier had honked himself hoarse over my mittens, climbed onto a wooden sledge from Norway, pulled a wool blanket up to his beak, and rode it north across his own people's ice behind a diesel engine, and the only sound he made for the next hour was once, very quietly, to the junior next to him. Note the runners. Wood does not stall. Before we left the rearguard site, Voss did a thing that looked at the time like scavenging, and turned out to be the night's best logistics decision after the tea. The dead sledges carried the column's spares. 2 hearth cores, crated, pristine, and useless, since a hearth core without its circulation is a furnace sealed inside its own coffin. The audit-certified procedure for a non-functioning core was, I quote the manual, "returned to depot for service." Voss read the crate label by headlamp, said something in Norwegian his grandmother would not have cared for, and took both cores aboard anyway, along with a pry bar, a hand drill, and a roll of the Vesic's own cargo foil. "They're warm," he said, when Ojo raised an eyebrow at the weight. 40 kilos each of warm that doesn't need software. I just have to teach them to share. He spent the next 2 hours of the drive in the back of the mule, with a casualty asleep against his shoulder and a hearth core between his boots, drilling convection ports through the housing shroud by hand, deliberate as a man carving a pipe, learning on the spare every cut he would later make at the column camp with an audience of its own engineers around him. By the time we saw the signal fire, he could gut a core's airflow in 19 minutes. The manufacturer's service depot was 11 light years away. The pry bar was right there. The audit had not provided a grading category for that distinction, and the gray ledger now has one, and I am not going to apologize for what I named it. Kesseth, meanwhile, had turned out to be cargo worth his weight. He was the column surveyor. The positions Pinnock carried were 8 hours stale, and Kesseth had the order of march, the camp doctrine, and the Vanguard's relay schedule in his head, and once the tea had thawed his voice loose, he gave Ojo all of it, clean and professional, between sips, where the column would consolidate and why, which shelters would fail first by manufacturing lot, where the wreck lay relative to the last grounded relay, and the bearing of the crevassed country between. A proud man being precisely useful to the people he'd laughed at without being asked twice, I gave him a second mug for it, and noted in the ledger that the scale on this moon was never the species. It was always only the doctrine. The cells don't fail loud. That's the thing. I keep coming back to it, and the gray ledger has a page on it now with more underlining than I generally permit myself. Nothing exploded out there. Nothing burned. The Concord's beautiful equipment just went quiet, politely, in order of its dependencies, and every machine reported its own death to a network that had died first. The audit had asked me what informs me of failure, and I'd said I get cold, and the room had honked, and out here on the shelf was the punchline nobody had written down. Their machines had no way to get cold. They had telemetry instead of discomfort. It is possible to engineer away every honest signal a thing can give you, and the Vesic had done it brilliantly at scale and called the result readiness. We raised the column twice more on the HF while we ran. Strell's voice both times, steadier than the first call, reading his grease pencil log like a man who had found a handhold and did not intend to be embarrassed about how plain it was. 41 souls, 4 shelters, candles, no. They didn't have candles. They had the hearth cores, warm and circulating nothing. So Vayek had ordered the shelters dug into the snow to trap what the cores still gave off, which was the second correct decision of the night. And the core's waste heat plus burrow physics plus Vesek down was holding the 4 shelters somewhere survivable and falling, slowly falling. Strell read the numbers off the wall where he'd written them, hour by hour, a cooling curve in China marker, and Amura listened with her eyes closed, doing the arithmetic every cold weather medic carries preloaded. 11 hours, she said, comfortably. Then it stops being comfortable. We'll be there in 5, Voss said. We were there in 6. The last 40 kilometers crossed a frost heave field, old pressure ridges like a sea state, somebody had paused. And the wands came off the rack and Sandu and I walked them ahead of the mule's lights in. Shifts, planting orange flags down the only line the sledge train could hold. Walking point in a deep clear at -86 is the coldest work I have ever done, and I include the plateau, and I am going to tell you the truth. I loved it. Every flag that went into that snow went in straight. The audit grades you, the room grades you, but the ice grades you honestly, and we were passing. At 20 past 10 station clock, the mule's lights picked up a shape on the horizon line. Low domes in a row, snow-banked and above the middle one, hanging dead still in the freezing starlight, a thin gray feather of smoke. They'd heard the engine 20 minutes before we arrived. Sound carries forever in a deep clear, and Vayek had ordered the one thing burned that. The manifest said could burn, a crate of ration padding in a hearthcore's empty cradle, as a marker for us, a signal fire. Oldest item in any museum there is. On column in sight, I said into the HF. Somebody put the kettle on. We do not have a kettle. Strell's voice came back, after a pause, with the first dry edge I'd heard in it all night. You will, I said. Flight Commander Vayek met us standing up, outside at -86, in a stalled suit with the collar open, because some men are going to be who they are no matter what the thermometer says. And the step is the step even 11 light years from home. His throat feathers had frost deep in the silver, and his eyes were sunk, and his voice was a rasp. And he stood at the head of his dug-in camp like it was a parade ground and gave Ojo the column's state in 4 flat sentences. 41 souls, 19 cold casualties, 6 serious, 0 dead, vanguard of 7 at the wreck silent for 11 hours. And then he did the thing I have thought about many times since, the thing that told me everything worth knowing about why this particular bird had a command, and Strell that morning had a clipboard. He looked at our train, the hammering diesel, the wooden sledges, the wool, the steam already rising off the stove Sandu had lit before the mule finished stopping, and he said, Lieutenant, my equipment has failed and yours has not. From this hour, the relief is yours to run. Tell us what to do and we will do it. No ceremony, no apology. Not then, apologies are for survivors, and he wasn't counting his yet. Just a commander striking his own flag on the spot because the arithmetic said to. Ojo didn't make him stand in it for even a second. Get your casualties sorted worst first, Commander, and put every bird who can still work on snow detail. We dig your shelters deeper and we get fire into them, and then we talk about your vanguard. What followed was 3 hours I mostly remember through my hands. We went shelter to shelter and did what we'd done at the rear guard, scaled up. Snowbank to the ridge lines, candles racked in tins down the center lines, the second stove cycling pot after pot, tea and sugar and butter going down feathered throats in a production line. Pinnit ran off the back of a sledge with the gravity of a bird, administering communion. The wool ran short at 31 bodies, so the priority list ran by Amura's triage tags and not by rank. And I will note for the record that Vayek took his blanket last, and that when I finally got it around his shoulders, he looked at it for a long moment, rubbed a corner between 2 fingers, and said quietly, animal hair not as a joke, but the way you read a word off a ruin, like it was a thing his grandmother's grandmother might have known, and his manifest had forgotten. The hearth cores were Voss's hours. The cores themselves were fine. An isotope brick doesn't care about static, but every gram of their heat was trapped behind dead circulation. Fans and pumps and regulators all stalled, and their housings were not designed to open in the field, were in fact designed specifically not to, which Voss regarded as a moral failing on the part of the designer and addressed with a pry bar. He could not make their electronics live. Nothing could in the glitter. What he did instead was older than electronics. He gutted the airflow shrouds, opened the convection paths with tin snips and swearing, and turned each core from a dead smart heater into a dumb hot brick, and dumb hot bricks, positioned low in a dug-in shelter, under physics that have not changed since before either of our species could write, heat the air just fine. The temperature in Shelter 2 came up 9 degrees in an hour. The Vesic watching him work were the same engineers who had signed the audit, and not one of them said the word museum, and Voss, to his permanent credit, did not say it either. He just handed the pry bar back to its owner and moved to Shelter 3. Strel I found in Shelter 4, the command shelter, sitting against a cargo case with his dead slate beside him and the shelter wall above him covered in China marker, hour lines, temperatures, names and pulse counts in neat four-fingered columns, sketches of the failed gauntlet release with the jam point circled, the whole anatomy of the night, written in grease on a membrane by a bird who had been issued one piece of functioning equipment and had used it to do his actual job through the worst hours of his life. He looked up at me, and his eyes were sunk and his feathers were flat, and he had a wool cap on, his head with the ear slits cut crooked, and he said, "Quartermaster, I require a correction to the record." "Sit still," I said. "Drink first." "The record," he said, with a casualty stubbornness, "states that the instrument and the alarm being the same component is remarkable economy. It was entered as mockery. I require it re-entered as finding." His hand came up holding my grease pencil, and the hand was shaking, and his voice was not. 41 items, Quartermaster. I graded 41 items, and tonight I have personally relied upon 9 of them, and the only instrument in this camp that has told the truth all night is hanging around your neck on a string, like a mitten. He shut his eyes. "I have been composing the amendment for 6 hours. It is possible the cold has made me direct." "It does that," I said, and put the mug in his hands. "Drink. You can be direct on station time." He drank, both hands small astonished sips, the same as every casualty since the dawn of cold. Then he said, almost to himself, looking at the candle burning level in its tin between us, 9 hours per unit, heater, clock, and gas detector. 90 grams. A long breath. "We brought a year of warmth, Quartermaster, and it could not last a week. You brought 30 candles, 11 light years." I graded them ceremonial. "They are ceremonial," I said. "The ceremony is everybody lives." I'm told that line is now written on the wall of the Concord Polar School in 3 languages, which embarrasses me because I didn't compose it. I just said the thing that was true and went to check the next shelter. That's the part the plaque leaves out. There's always a next shelter. The Vanguard question came to a head at noon, station clock around a sledge map weighted with match tins. The wreck of the Tessely Vein lay another 46 kilometers north. 7 Vesic Vanguards, silent 11 hours, last known feeding power to the survival blister, where the freighter's 3 crew had now been living for 9 days. The blister drew from the Vanguard cells. The Vanguard cells were, by every pattern of the night, stalled, which meant the blister was now a cooling can with 3 souls in it, 2 Vesic and a Suvari engineer per the manifest, and a Suvari is an amphibian, and an amphibian in a cooling can is a casualty on a countdown that does not negotiate. Vaic laid it out himself, rasping fair, sparing nobody including himself, and then he said the brave thing, the thing that cost him more than the open collar. "My column can contribute nothing to a further advance. If the relief extends, it extends on your machine and your judgment, at your risk. I have no standing to ask it." "You're not asking it," Ojo said. "It's on the way back if you hold the map the right way up," which is not, I should say, what the map looked like. The map looked like 46 more kilometers in a deepening clear with a casualty camp behind us that needed every blanket and most of the fuel. The split came down the only way it could. Sandhu and Amura would run the camp and start ferrying the worst 6 casualties south to the rearguard cache line we'd flagged, then back, leapfrog style, with Pin 8 keeping the manifest of who lay where, because if you do not write it down on a night like that, the ice will keep your secrets for you. Voss, Ojo, and I would take the mule and 1 light sledge north, with a second stove, 10 candles, the rope, and the last full drum. Vaic stood at the camp edge as we pulled out. He'd found enough voice to put an order into the air behind us, formal, parade ground in Concord standard so every bird in the camp heard it plainly. "Column will log the departure of Relief Element Museum 1, extended objective. Column will further log," and the RAS cracked and came back, "that the designation is rescinded as inaccurate. Museums keep the past." A beat flat and dry as the shelf. "This equipment is current." Voss put her in gear. "Always was," he said, to the windscreen, "too quiet for anyone's log but mine." The 46 kilometers to the wreck crossed the calm, which is what the station charts called a shear zone, where the shelf ice bends over a buried ridge and cracks like old paint. Crevasse country. The certified route ran a long dogleg west around it, 11 extra kilometers, and the certified route had been surveyed by instruments that were now so much frozen jewelry. And the blister was a cooling can, so Ojo held the map flat against the dash, looked at the dogleg, looked at the straight line, and said, "Ray, how do they cross crevasse fields in your museum?" "Slowly," I said. "On ropes with a long stick. It's all in the manual." "Did anyone here read the manual?" "Twice," I said, and went to get the rope. We crossed the comb in 4 hours that I will be feeling in my knees for the rest of my life. Probe and plant, probe and plant, wands burning orange in the headlights, me and Ojo alternating point on the long line with Voss idling the mule a rope length back, reading the snow texture in the lights, the way the old hands taught me on the plateau, the dull stripes where wind-crust bridges avoid, the shallow trough that means the bridge is sagging, the hard blue gleam of honest ice. Twice the probe went through into nothing, and we walked the line sideways until it didn't. Once the bridge let go on its own, 20 meters off our flags, with a boom like a ship's gun and a breath of ice smoke rising slow and sparkling into the headlights, and the hole it left would have taken the mule, the sledge, and all 3 of us, and given back nothing. Nobody said anything clever about that one. We planted the next wand and kept probing. I'll tell you what I thought about. Working point across the comb at -87 with a bamboo stick older than my service record. I thought about the audit. Item 55. Wands, marker, bamboo with cloth flags, quantity 80 and Strel turning 1 in the light, asking the risers whether the humans had brought fishing equipment, and the geese honking, and the certified nav constellation gleaming away overhead in its certainty. The constellation was still up there right now, talking to nobody, its certified signal scattered to hash by a curtain of charged dust. The stick worked everywhere. The stick had always worked everywhere. There is a whole philosophy in that if you stand still long enough to be lectured by it, and at -87 you do not stand still, so the philosophy stayed short. The more a thing assumes, the more ways it can be wrong, and a stick assumes nothing. We came down out of the shear zone at 4:30 and saw the Tesla vein at 5. A wrecked freighter on a starlit ice shelf is a cathedral somebody dropped. She'd come in shallow and broken in 3, and the stern section stood up out of the blown snow at an angle, taller than Pelham's masts, hull plates starlit gray, and every line of her furred white with 9 days of rime. No lights. The Vanguard's camp lay in her lee, 2 shelters and a relay mast, dark. And for one long bad minute, rolling closer with the engine, the only sound on that whole plane, dark looked like dark. Then a hatch lamp came up on the stern section, hand cranked, wavering, and swung side to side, and Ojo let out half a breath, and Voss said, "There they are," in the voice he otherwise reserves for engines that catch. The Vanguard had done the right things, mostly, and been wrecked by their equipment anyway, which by then we could have recited as the anthem of the night. When the cells stalled, they'd consolidated into the wreck itself. Correct. Steel and composite hold heat better than failing membranes and moved the blister's 3 occupants up into the stern section's crew gallery with them and pooled the last live cells to keep the blister's medical cradle running for the Suvari, who was by then the whole problem. 7 Vanguard, all standing, frost injuries but ambulatory. 2 freighter crew, weak, 9 days of kin living, walking wounded at best. And the engineer, Oshu, amphibian, skin temperature already 4 degrees into the gray zone, wrapped in every dead heat wrap on the manifest and cooling anyway, because a Suvari's body does not shiver, it just slows quietly like a tide going out. Amura wasn't with us. I want that understood about what Ojo did next, because the lieutenant had a casualty cooling toward a line no one comes back across, a medic 46 kilometers south, and a handbook position that says you do not move a hypothermic casualty roughly and you do not rewarm one fast, and what she had to work with was a stove, 10 candles, a wool blanket roll, and a quartermaster with 2 polar winters and a radio. So we did it by radio. Sandu rigged the relay patch at the column camp, and Amura's voice came up to us through the glitter hiss. Calm as a tide table, and for 2 hours she ran my hands from 46 kilometers away, the warm sweet liquid in sips, only because he could still swallow. The stove-warmed stones, actual stones, ballast gravel out of the wreck's trim tanks, heated in the pot and wrapped in wool socks, item 9, and laid against the big vessels of the neck and the core, never the limbs. The candle tent we built right there inside the crew gallery, canvas over cargo frames, 3 flames, trapping a bubble of +5 air in a dead ship on a dead plane, and the Suvari engineer lying in the middle of it wrapped in Norwegian wool with his pulse under my fingers and Amura's voice in my ear saying, "Count, count again, good." Again, somewhere in the middle of that, one of the Vanguard birds, watching the sock of hot gravel go in against the casualty's neck, said to the bird beside him, very low, in Vesic, not knowing or maybe not caring that Pinnett had spent the week teaching me the basics. "Write to your mother. Tell her the humans are boiling rocks." And it is working, and we graded the socks. By station midnight, Ashu's pulse had come up off the floor and his skin temperature had crossed back. Over the gray line, and Amura's voice on the relay said the word stable, and the crew gallery of the Tesla vein, 9 Vesic, 1 Suvari, 3 humans and a candle tent was the quietest celebration I have ever attended. The freighter's mate, a leathery old bird named Corveth who had been 9 days in a can and looked it, raised his mug of indecent tea toward the candles like a man toasting a saint, and said the only thing he said all night, to item 41. The isotopes, the actual cargo, the reason 41 birds had marched out onto the shelf in the first place, turned out to weigh 400 kilos in shielded flasks. And the flight recorder weighed 11, and we took all of it, because Ojo holds the map the right way up, but she also doesn't like making trips twice. The flasks rode the light sledge. The casualties rode the big one, deep in wool, with the vanguards walking wounded mushing alongside in dead suits and live blankets. And the mule took the whole train south along our own orange flags, back across the comb on the line we'd already proven, which is the entire reason you flag a line, and the manual says so, on the page with the corner I'd folded down years ago. The clear began to break as we came off the shear zone. You feel it before you read it. The air picks up a grain of motion. The glitter starts to lie down. The cold goes from a pressure to merely a fact. By the time we raised the column camp, the eastern horizon had a low gray smear on it that meant wind coming, real weather, honest weather, and the spirit thermometer on my chest read -74, which I am embarrassed to tell you felt mild. The camp had held. Sandhu and Amura had run the leapfrog all night. The worst 6 were already south at the cash line. The shelter stood at survivable plus on candle stubs and gutted hearth cores. 0 dead still anywhere on the whole shelf. Strell's grease pencil wall had a new column, headed in careful Concord capitals, relief methods, observed, and under it the night itemized. Snow banking, candle physics, butter tea, hot stones, wool rotation, wand discipline, item by item, graded. Every grade said the same word. I stood in front of that wall with a mug going cold in my hand and read it twice, and Pinnett appeared at my shoulder the way he did, sideways, and read it with me and said, with a ledger keeper's reverence, he has used the full scale. He never uses the full scale. The word was exemplary. All the way down, in grease on a shelter wall, at the bottom of the coldest night either of our species had spent on that moon, written with item 30 by the same hand that had graded it a crayon. I'd billed the Concord for the pencil anyway. Some principles you keep. The run home was a race we only understood we were in once the wind arrived. A deep clear doesn't end. Pinnett's grandmother could have told us. It breaks. And what breaks it is the atmosphere remembering its job all at once. The gray smear on the east grew up into a wall, and the first gusts came across the shelf like thrown gravel, and suddenly the museum was working for its living. Canvas double-lashed. Casualties cocooned, wands snatched and planted on the move, the mule grinding south at her steady, stupid, beautiful 30 kilometers an hour, while the temperature climbed and the visibility fell, trading one murderer for a cheaper one. The column came with us. That was the arithmetic nobody had to say out loud. The camp had held in the still cold, but a camp of stalled equipment in a rising ground blizzard is a burial site with paperwork pending. So everything that could walk, walked, and everything that couldn't rode, and the relief of 41 became a migration of 54. Humans and Vesic and one stable amphibian strung down a flag line in the blowing white, roped in tens, candle lanterns swinging at the rope heads, because a flame in a tin tells you at a glance what a dead heads-up display never will. Vayek walked the whole way. I told you about the collar. I won't pretend I was surprised. He took a rope head the first hour and kept it, breaking trail in a stalled suit and a gray blanket with his frost-silvered throat bare to the wind, and behind him 40 birds who had watched their entire technological civilization go quiet in a single night followed the swinging candle in the hand of their commander. And I walked my own rope and thought, not for the last time, that the difference between equipment and doctrine is that doctrine doesn't stall. The step was still in that bird. The lattice had been laid over it, not instead of it. That distinction was about to become the most expensive lesson in the Concord's polar history, and the cheapest because the tuition had somehow, against every rule the ice has, come to 0 lives. Pelham Station rose out of the blow at 8:30 evening station clock. First the masts with Sandhu's illegal HFY are singing in the wind, then the lit windows of the operations floor, every pane of them full of feathered silhouettes, and the bay doors standing open with light pouring out gold across the snow, and inside in a row, gleaming, every heat cradle and infirmary trolley the station owned, and Prefect Kalla standing in the wind on the apron itself, no escort, waiting. Pinnett had radioed ahead the only manifest that mattered, and so the prefect already had the number, but there is a difference between having a number and watching it walk in, and she stood there and counted anyway, out loud in Concord Standard, every soul that came off the line and the sledges, 54, and then she turned to Lieutenant Ojo. And Ojo said the line that is now in the station log and in the Concord inquiry record, and on the wall of a polar school 11 light years from the country where they invented the sledge. Relief Element Museum 1, returning. All counted. Nobody stayed on the ice. The infirmary filled, the kettles never stopped. And the next 3 days were stores work, casualty boards, and sleep in slices. And I'm going to compress them because what matters is not the convalescence, but what the convalescence did with it. The VESIC are list makers to their marrow. It's why I'd like them on site. Honking and all, and 140 list makers who have just had their entire equipment philosophy disproven in a single audit-shaped night do not sulk. They reconcile. By the second morning, there was a queue at the store's office, not for blankets, for the manual. I had 4 hard copies of the Terran Cold Weather Field Manual on station. By the third day, they had been photographed, transcribed, annotated, and Pinay confessed this with his feathers flat in embarrassment, formally entered into the Pelham Station reference library under emergency. Provisions, catalog code the clerks had chosen themselves. Primitive methods, essential. I told Pinnett the title was inaccurate. He said the catalog system had no code for humility and they were working with the fields available. I let it stand. Bureaucracy is its own apology when you know how to read it, and I have spent 31 years learning to read it. Kesseth finished his apology in the mess hall, in front of witnesses, because that's the grammar. The insult was public, so the correction had to be. He stood with his wings half spread and his eyes down and got all the way through the formal phrasing this time, the part that translates roughly as I weighed you with a broken scale and announced the figure, and the mess went quiet to hear it, and I'll tell you the truth, I didn't enjoy it. The audit morning had been funny. This wasn't. A proud surveyor with bandaged feet doing public penance over a pair of socks is not a victory. It's just the bill arriving at the wrong table. So when he finished, I said the only thing I had, which was, your scale's fixed now. Sit down and eat. And Amura slid the pot down the table. The lentil stew the entire VESIC complement had refused for 2 weeks on textural principle, and Kesseth looked at it the way he'd once looked at the southern horizon, decided the humans were probably right about this too, and ate 3 bowls. By the weekend, the kitchen was making it in drums. The cook, a human-shy bird named Alec, asked Amura for the recipe through an intermediary, the intermediary being a written requisition form, because some species court courage one document at a time. Vijik came to the store's office on the 4th day, alone, healing, collar open, and he did not apologize either, which I respected, because what he'd come to do was harder. He put his own field slate on my counter, alive again now the glitter was gone, and on it was the draft of his incident report to the Concord Salvage Directorate, and he turned it to face me. Before I transmit, he said, I am required to verify factual accuracy with involved parties. A pause. I am not required to do it in person. Note that I am doing it in person. I read it. It was a commander's report of the kind you hope you never earn, unsparing, specific, and aimed entirely at himself. Equipment trusted beyond test conditions on his signature. Certified forecast preferred over contradictory instrument data presented by attached personnel. Relief made possible solely by the equipment and doctrine of the Terran detachment, whose readiness had been graded non-viable, in a proceeding he had personally ratified, 4 days before that grading was disproven at the rate of 1 item per hour, in the field, with his columns lives as the test bench. It's accurate, I said. It is incomplete, he said. Every report of this incident will be incomplete until someone explains to me a thing I cannot derive. The gold eyes came up. Your manifest. Quartermaster. It was too good. 5 personnel? Yes, but blanket weight for 50. Candles for shelters you did not bring. A medical kit scaled for casualties you could not alone have sustained. A vehicle absurdly oversized for a 5-soul detachment, with a winch rated for our sledges, and drum fuel for a range that only makes sense if the destination was a stranded column. He let the list sit there between us, the way I'd once let a sock sit on a table. I have run your equipment list backward, Decker. It does not describe a support detachment. It describes a rescue, pre-positioned. You packed for our failure before you ever saw our ice. It was, for the record, the finest piece of equipment analysis performed by anyone of any species in the entire history of Pelham Station, and it had taken him 1 night in the cold and 4 days of thinking to do what the audit had 40 days and a matinee audience to not do, which is to look at someone else's manifest and ask what problem it was actually built to solve. Commander, I said, that's above my counter, but you might want to be in the operations room when the directorate packet lands. I'm told there's 1 inbound. He looked at me for a long moment. Somewhere behind those gold eyes, a column of figures finished adding itself. The audit, he said slowly. The morning of the audit. 40 of us in the risers, grading your candles. His throat feathers moved. What were you doing, Quartermaster, while we graded your candles? My job, I said, and against every regulation of the matinee, against the whole grammar of the morning that had started all of this, Flight Commander Vaic of the Concord Salvage Service threw back his silver head and laughed. The first time I ever heard it from him, a great unlovely honk that rattled the store's cage, the laugh of a man who has just gotten the joke and discovered it was on him and found taking inventory that he was somehow still rich. 11 light years, he said when he had it back under control. They sat in our risers for 2 hours, being graded item by a flock of fools and never said a word. He wiped his eyes with the back of a bandaged hand. Decker, in the name of every wind on the steppe, who audits like that? Quartermasters, I said, and stamped his report accurate and slid it back across the counter. The amendment hearing convened in the cargo bay 9 days after the return because VESEC procedure required that a public grading be corrected in the venue where it was issued before an audience no smaller than the original. They needn't have worried about the audience. The risers were full an hour early, and they'd brought in risers from the gymnasium, and there were birds standing along the back wall 3 deep, and the high windows had faces in them. Pelham Station had laughed as one organism, and it intended to take its medicine the same way. My equipment table stood where it had stood. Same crates, same tags, my handwriting. I'd been asked to lay it out again, item for item, and I had with one addition I'll get to. Strell entered in parade dress with his audit slate under his wing, and his feet, I happen to know from the infirmary roster, were still bandaged under the formal leggings, and he walked the length of the bay without hurrying and took the same position he'd taken the first morning, and the room went silent the way only a guilty room can. This proceeding amends Equipment Readiness Review 441, he said. I conducted the original review. The amendments are mine to read. Concord procedure permits delegation of this duty. He paused. Exactly the showman's pause it had always been, aimed at himself this time. Delegation is declined. And then he read them. All of it, the entire audit, item by item, in the same beautiful diction. The original grading first and the field annotation after. And I am going to set down the ones the station still quotes, because the record should hold them the way the bay heard them. Item 9. Hand garment, wool, pair, original grading, museum grade, annotation worn by Surveyor Kesseth during evacuation, 22 hours, no injury to the covered extremities. Worn subsequently, heated by stove, as a containment for hot ballast gravel applied to a hypothermic casualty of a species the garment's designers have never met. The casualty survived. The garment survived. Amended grading, exemplary, dual use. Item 14, hand coverings, tethered, original grading, as one does with infants. The original grading is read into the record complete, honored colleagues, because I composed it as comedy, and it should be preserved as instruction. Not a honk anywhere in the bay. Annotation column gauntlet losses during the stall 11. Tethered losses among relief personnel 0. The infants kept their hands. Amended grading exemplary. Adoption recommended, Concord-wide effective before this hearing concludes. Item 22. Stove paraffin 2 burner. Original grading. A punishment described as a kitchen. Annotation. Operating continuously for 61 hours across 3 sites, it produced approximately 400 liters of hot liquid, which the medical annex to this amendment credits jointly with items 9 and 41 in the survival of 19 cold casualties. It has 3 moving parts. The annex has counted them. Amended grading, exemplary. Item 30, marker grease, field issue, original grading. A crayon, requested as a souvenir. He took it out of his breast pocket, where it had ridden since the morning he signed for it, and held it up, and turned it in the light, the same theatrical wrist, and the whole bay looked at the little black stub of it. Annotation. Sole functioning data recording instrument available to the column command shelter for the duration of the event. The cooling curve it recorded is now the foundational dataset of the Concord's revised polar doctrine. The souvenir, and here his voice did its only strange thing of the morning, going perfectly flat, the flatness I knew from a shelter at -80, has been invoiced by the Terran detachment, and the invoice has been paid, and the auditor declines on personal grounds to return the item. Item 41, candle, wax, quantity 30, original grading, ceremonial. He set the slate down on my table beside the open tin. Annotation. The ceremony is everybody lives. Amended grading, exemplary. The original grading is also sustained. It went on, all 40-some items, the bamboo and the matches and the indecent tea, and I stood by my table and let it happen to me, which I had learned, watching Kesseth in the mess hall, is the only decent way to receive an apology built by a bureaucracy. Stand still, let them file it, sign where indicated. When he reached the end of the manifest, he stopped and looked at the one item on the table that had not been there the first morning, and the bay looked with him. The gray ledger, closed, squared to the table edge, no markings on the cover. There is, Strell said, one item present, which does not appear on the original manifest, and I am informed by the prefect that its disposition is not mine to grade. He looked at me. The whole station looked at me. Quartermaster, the floor is yours. I want it noted that I did not enjoy what came next, and also that I did not hate it as much as a better man would have. I am a supply officer. I had stood at parade rest through one matinee, a wager, a deep clear, a crevasse field, and 9 days of being right, and I would have happily filed the whole business under closed and gone back to my bin index. But the directorate packet had landed 2 days before, and Kala had read it, and Vijek had read it, and procedure, blessed procedure, the one religion our two species turn out to share, required the reading to be public. So Prefect Kala came down to the floor and unfolded the hard copy with the directorate seals on it, and read it to her own station in the flat voice of a woman who had decided that if her command was to be embarrassed, it would be embarrassed thoroughly, formally, and only once. The packet ran 4 pages. The part that mattered ran 1 paragraph. That following the loss of 3 Concorde salvage teams to cold systems failures in 2 years, the Salvage Directorate had contracted with Earth, whose polar services the Concorde's actuaries had flagged as the statistical anomaly of the surveyed worlds. 3 centuries of operations in conditions exceeding equipment rating, with survival rates the actuarial annex declined to believe until it had been audited twice, to dispatch a field assessment detachment to a representative polar station, that the detachment's mandate, sealed at Earth's request to keep the assessment honest, was to evaluate Concorde cold weather equipment, doctrine, and personnel under operational conditions, and that the detachment's quartermaster held directorate authority to file findings directly, said findings to carry the force of an external audit. Kala folded the page. The bay had gone so quiet I could hear the wind on the high windows. For the station's log, she said, the directorate requests transmission of the external auditor's findings at his earliest convenience. Quartermaster Decker, does a draft exist? It does, Prefect, I said. Is it complete? 1 line outstanding, I said, and left it there because it was true, and because I have my own sense of theater, it just runs quieter than Strel's. The bay took the arithmetic about 4 seconds, which for 140 list makers is a long time, and I watched it land in waves. The realization that the audit had been mutual from the first morning, that while 40 of them sat in the risers grading socks, the socks owner had been standing at parade rest grading them, that every honk in this room had gone into a gray cover with a directorate seal waiting behind it. I watched Keseth close his eyes. I watched Pinnett, in the clerk's row, sit up like a bird who has just understood what he'd been helping carry all those mornings he walked the store's ledger over. And I watched Strel, front and center in parade dress on bandaged feet, work it through to the bottom, all the way to the morning he'd held up a sock-like evidence in a murder trial, and arrive where I'd hoped he would, not at humiliation, at professional vertigo. The look of an auditor meeting for the first time the auditor above him. He asked the only question that was ever worth asking, and he asked it in front of everyone, which is why I'll vouch for that bird to the end of my service. Quartermaster, he said, the findings, what did we grade? You want the line items or the summary, I said. The summary, he said. We have heard this morning what I do with line items. So I gave the summary, out loud to the station, the same words that went to the directorate over my signature that evening, and I gave it the way findings should be given, flat, no seasoning. That Concorde polar equipment was the finest ever assessed by my service and unfit for service, the 2 conditions being related, because every component assumed the survival of every other, and the assessment found no floor under the assumptions. That Concorde polar personnel were physiologically the best cold operators my service had ever observed, and were being actively trained out of every instinct that made them so, by equipment that promised they would never need instincts again. That Vesic Field Command, tested by total systems failure, had improvised correctly, consolidated correctly, preserved its people, kept records by hand through the worst of it, and walked its column home, and that the doctrine which produced such officers deserved better, machines or fewer prophecies from the ones it had. That the audit of the human detachment conducted at Pelham Station 441 was thorough, disciplined, and wrong, and that the Concorde should note carefully that being wrong in committee had cost it nothing, because the same culture that produced the committee had also produced the commander who, on the worst night on record, looked at a museum and ordered his people to learn from it before sunrise. Finding overall, I said. Provisional pass. Conditions attached. Name the conditions, Kala said. Wool, wax, wicks, and wands, I said. And 1 auditor seconded to my counter for a season to learn what the categories are for. The directorate can pick the auditor. The directorate did not have to pick the auditor. The directorate received, attached to my findings, a transfer request that had been filed, time-stamped, 11 minutes after the hearing closed, by Auditor Strel, endorsed by Flight Commander Vajek, with a single annotation in the endorsement field, which I am reliably informed read, informal Concorde script. He has already been issued the pencil. The requisition started that afternoon and have not stopped since. Wool by the container, candles by the gross paraffin stoves on a production license. A firm on Earth granted the Concorde for 1 symbolic credit, the promise of a plaque. String for the gauntlets until the gauntlet redesign ships. The mule got a sister vehicle and, at the loadmaster's own insistence, a registry entry. The station log now lists 2 diesel tractors under the official designation museum class, and the loadmaster will fight any bird who smiles about it. Pinnett runs the joint store's ledger with me, 2 scripts side by side in the same bin index, and is composing on his own time a supplementary manual chapter titled Borough Doctrine of the Vessening Crossing, Reconciled with Terran Trench Practice, dedicated to his grandmother, and I have read the draft, and the dedication is the least of why it's good. The last line of all of it, the line I'd held open in the findings I filed at the end of that season, when the second deep clear came down on Pelham Station and the whole machine we'd rebuilt got its examination. The temperature went to -91. The station's grid sagged and the glitter came in curtains and nobody died and nobody came close. And the duty log for the worst night reads like a grocery list, which is the highest grade the ice gives out. Vaic ran the shelf patrols on candle lanterns and wands. Imura's protocol sat printed at every aid point in 2 scripts. And at the bottom of the worst hour, with the certified systems down across half the station, I walked the store's corridor and found the night clerks brewing tea on a paraffin stove, indecent with butter, completely calm, honking quietly at some private joke, and not one of them found the scene remarkable, and that is the finding. The line went to the directorate in the morning. Assessment closed. They don't need us anymore. Recommend the Concorde be invoiced for the candles, and told what the invoice is really for. Strel came down to stores on the morning my transfer orders posted. Parade dress, feet-long heeled, the pencil in his breast pocket worn down to a stub he will clearly never sharpen. He had come, he said, to settle the final open item in his file before my departure, and he laid the original wager log on my counter. Witness, time-stamped, 9 days before the night that renamed the museum. The candle outlasted the lattice, he said. The debt stands, item 9, quartermaster. At my own expense, as logged. I am told there is now a waiting list, and I am telling you that the auditor does not stand on waiting lists. He stands on procedure, and procedure says debts settle at the original counter. I took down a pair of wool socks gray, knitted on a world he'd never see, by hands that would never believe where these ended up. I cut the ear slits in nothing, because socks don't need them, but I checked the tag twice, because they were leaving my inventory and some principles you keep. He signed for the socks. I filed the receipt.